All right, guys, today is November 5th. It is a Thursday, and here is your social studies lesson for the day. So, our unit question, which we'll be wrapping up in the next week and a half here, is: were the 13 colonies justified in their decision to declare war on Great Britain? Okay. Today's essential question, we're looking at the major events of the American Revolution. So, what are those events? What were the major events of the American Revolution? This is the last set of notes that you'll be taking for this unit, and then we'll have our final master grade, and then we'll move on to the next section. So today, what I would like you to do is open your notes. You'll find it on Google Classroom. You'll find two attachments there. There's a video, and then there's Google Docs. I would like you to open the Google Docs. So that looks like this. Okay, it's been a little while since we've done notes, so I'll remind you how this works. Basically, on my slideshow, you will see underlined words. Anytime you see an underlined word on my slideshow, that means it corresponds with a blank on this sheet. And so if you see one of these marks on your sheet, that means that there's an underlined word on the slideshow that you need to find and fill in the blank. Okay. So I'm going to navigate over to my slideshow now. You should have your notes open. As always, make sure you hit the share arrow. The share arrow on your iPads is in the top right corner of the screen. This lets you type directly into the document so that you can type into those little highlighted blanks. If you're not hitting the share arrow, it doesn't create space for you as you're typing. It also does not save your work if you navigate away, so please hit the share arrow if you're on an iPad. As you can see on my screen, this is our essential question for the day. So go ahead and copy that down. That is the first blank of your assignment. It says essential question. Type the essential question below. So you're going to type, what were the major events of the American Revolution? And the reason we're learning about this is that a lot of people, a lot of patriots, sacrifice their lives for the freedoms we have. So it's important to know what happened during that time. So I'm gonna move on here. If at any point you need to pause to copy the blanks down, please feel free to do so. I'm just gonna move through here so we keep this video as short as we can here. So liberty or death, the story of the American Revolution. So it starts with Continental Congress. So all 13 colonies send representatives to meet, and these representatives are some of the brightest and most influential people in the colonies, and they basically meet to discuss the current relationship with Great Britain. And if you look down here, I've got a timeline across the bottom here. And so this, we're actually not quite at 1775 yet. So the First Continental Congress meets in 1774, and they kind of discuss the relationship with Great Britain. Then, in 1775, they meet again, and they agree that they need to create a continental army. And the idea is just to create this army for defense. It's not to attack the British, it's just for defense. And they think that hopefully, if the British sees that they now have an army, that they'll be like, okay, fine, you can protect yourselves. But that's not what ends up happening, as we know. So this doesn't stop the British. The British aren't afraid of this new Continental Army that the Congress formed. And so Continental Congress meets a third time. And this is after the fighting had started. This is after the Battle of Lexington and Concord. And so this time, this is where they agree to sign the Declaration of Independence. Once again, if you need to pause at any point, feel free to do so. I'm going to move on here. So, the Declaration of Independence, we've already looked at this in our previous lessons. This was written by Thomas Jefferson. It was revised by Congress, and it covered a couple different things. So it declared the following. It outlined human rights that not just Americans have, but all people have, like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. they declare independence from the king, and they also provide a list of grievances, basically a list of everything that the British have done wrong or done to the colonies to make them angry and to cause this course of action. So this was in 1776. All right, moving on here. So in this war, in this disagreement, whatever you want to call it, we have a couple different sides. First, we have the Patriots. If you're a patriot, that means that you supported independence from Great Britain. You wanted to break away. Then we have the Loyalists. Loyalists are loyal to Great Britain. They supported loyalty to the crown, to the king. And then about 30% of people were undecided. They kind of fell in the middle. They didn't really want one or the other, or they weren't sure which one they wanted. So you can see on the pie chart here, almost half of the people living in the colonies were patriots. A quarter of them were loyalists, and then the other 30% didn't really know what side they supported, or they didn't support a side. Let's take a second, copy those percentages down. Now we're going to take a look at the two armies, the Continental Army and the British Army. So I've got little trading cards here. So we have the Continental Army. Nicknames that you'll hear for them are the Minutemen, Patriots, or Militia. Okay, and they had a couple different strengths. First of all, they had excellent leadership. Not just General Washington, but a lot of the other generals that he worked with were very good leaders, and that gave them an advantage. They also had an extreme motivation to fight, and this motivation was basically because they were fighting on their home turf. They were fighting for their homes. They were fighting for their independence and for their rights. And those things were being threatened, and so they had a good reason to be fighting. Some of the weaknesses that the Continental Army had, they had limited supplies, and that's not just that doesn't just mean like weapons and ammunition. It also means clothing, which you don't think about as being particularly important until you're fighting in the winter and your soldiers don't have shoes and they're freezing, right? So their supplies were limited because all their supplies before this that were coming from overseas for the most part, right? They also had limited naval support. This was a big deal because most of the colonies were bordering the Atlantic Ocean, and so we had a very small navy. We didn't have that many ships, and we know that the British had a large navy, and they were able to basically patrol that coast and use it to their advantage, whereas we really couldn't do anything about it. So that was something that affected the Continental Army's effectiveness, basically. And then we had limited experience. Our soldiers, while our generals had seen combat, the only combat that any of the soldiers and militia had seen would have been the French and Indian War. Whereas the people in the British Army has been fighting all over the world in a bunch of different places, and they're just very experienced. They've seen a lot of battle, which just makes them more experienced soldiers. So that's what the Continental Army looks like. Let's look at the British Army now. So the British Army, nicknames for them are Redcoats, Tories, and Regulars. So like I just talked about, one of the strengths of the British Army is they are very experienced. They fought all over the world. They're very well trained and disciplined. The British Army has been around for a long time, and so they have these policies in place and training courses in place that makes their soldiers just well trained. And then finally, they're also extremely well supplied and funded. The British are able to continuously supply them with weapons and ammunition and clothing. This is not an issue. Supplies are always coming from overseas for the British Army, or from Canada, because keep in mind Canada is British as well. And then finally we have weaknesses. So the weaknesses that the British Army had are, number one, they're fighting far from home. So a lot of the soldiers were not happy to be in the colonies. They were homesick. They were missing their families. And they're also, this is not their home. They're not fighting to defend their home. They're fighting for They're fighting to get paid as soldiers. They're fighting for like money, basically. A lot of them. And then also they're using old tactics. So at this point, the Continental Army basically started refusing to use like the traditional tactics that have been used for hundreds of years at this point, because they realized they're not going to be able to win the war fighting the way that the British Army has been fighting for so long. And so they start coming up with new ways to fight, and the British Army doesn't really adapt very quickly to those ways, and so they're using these old tactics, and they're losing because of it. All right, so that outlines a pretty good comparison between the two armies here. We're going to move on here. So, following our timeline, if you look at the bottom here, 1775 was when the war started. We had the Declaration of Independence in 1776, and then we're basically covering the first 2 years of the war. So the first 2 years of the war did not go well for the colonies. And you'll remember that if you think back to those oversimplified videos we watched. The Patriots, which is us, the U.S., the colonies, they lose badly for the first 2 years of the war. The British even take control of New York. So first 2 years we are losing. Then the Battle of Saratoga happens, and this is considered a big turning point in the war. So basically what happened is the British Army was split into these two large forces. One of them was in Canada, and the leader of that force was called, his name was General Burgoyne. And then there's another force in New York, and the leader of that force, his name was General Howe. And the British came up with this strategy that if the two armies were able to meet and connect up, they would be able to separate the northern colonies from the southern colonies. They would be able to blockade it, and then that would help them win the war by keeping the colonies separated, not being able to resupply each other and move freely between the north and the south. And so this was the British plan. So we have these two forces, they're moving towards each other to meet, and this is what they want to do. Okay. Then, my slide is cut off here. I'm going to just put it here like this for a second. So then General Howe changes his plans at the last minute. He decides to leave Burgoyne on his own, and he ends up going to attack Philadelphia. So this leaves Burgoyne's forces alone, and the Continental Army finds him and attacks. And the battle takes place over a couple days, and the British win at first, but they're losing a lot of people. And then as the battle progresses, the Continental Army, more people show up, and they're able to win in the end. And so at the end of the Battle of Saratoga, the British casualties are very high, and most of Burgoyne's forces surrender and are captured. So we have these two huge British forces, and now one of them is basically completely wiped out. This is considered a big turning point in the war. And this had a couple different effects. Number one, after the victory, it caused morale in the colonies to go way up. So that morale basically means the attitude and the mood of the people fighting the war. So the Continental Army was just very happy with itself. They were excited that they had started winning. They had won this big battle. They had defeated one of these British generals, and it was just like an army's mood can really affect the way they fight. And so morale was high. Secondly, the other thing that the Battle of Saratoga did is it persuaded France to join the war on the side of the colonies, the rebels. And France's help, France is basically one of the huge reasons that we win the war. They were absolutely vital in eventually winning the war. All right. Let me see if I can get back into my slideshow here. Then we're going to jump ahead here. So you see on the timeline down here, we have Saratoga, right? We have Valley Forge, which, if you guys remember those letters that we looked at in our the Times to Try Men's Souls lesson, the journals, that's what they were talking about, is Valley Forge, the winter at Valley Forge. So we have those events. Saratoga happens. France joins the war shortly after Valley Forge. And then fighting starts to go much better. There are a bunch of battles, none of which are particularly important that we're going to talk about, but then we get to the Battle of Yorktown. This is about 2 years later, two and a half years later. So at Yorktown, there is a united army of French and Americans, and they surround the British. And they're also supported by French ships at sea. And so they basically close in around this British army that is in the city of Yorktown, and they beat the British army so badly that the British commander, surrenders. And so Yorktown was basically seen as the beginning of the end. The war didn't officially end for another 2 years, but the majority of the fighting was over at this point. The fighting did not really continue after this. Not a lot, at least. Nothing major. So, the final toll. The war lasted 8 years. And in the end, 25,000 Americans died. And I find it really interesting that only 8,000 of those 25,000 were in battle. Only 8,000 of people died in the battles of the war. Most people died from disease. And we're talking about soldiers here. 25,000 American soldiers died. 8,000 of them died in battle. 10,000 of them died from disease. That's how big a deal disease was at this point. We still did not have modern medicine, and so this was a common problem. And then finally, we have 7,000 soldiers that end up dying in prison camps. They're captured by the British, and they are left to starve, or they catch their own diseases. 7,000 people die in prison camps. So finally, that brings us to the Treaty of Paris. The Treaty of Paris was the official end of the war. It was signed in 1783, and it recognized U.S. independence. And this eventually inspired others, like France, to rebel against their kings. We'll talk about that at a later date. So this is the end of our notes for today. I want you to go back to your assignment. You should have all of your blanks filled out at this point, and on the very bottom you will see 3 reflection questions. Number 1 says, what was the motivation of the Continental Army? Okay. Number 2, what was the motivation of the British Army? And number 3, how did that motivation affect the way each army fought? Did it help them? Did it hurt them? How? Okay, so take your time, answer these 3 questions. These 3 questions are the main part of the grade for this assignment, so take your time on those. And that's all I have for you guys today. Thank you for joining me. Don't forget to be awesome, and I will see you guys next week.